Distinguished guests, colleagues, and participants, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our virtual colloquium on Translanguaging for Justice, Transformative Praxis in Education. I'm Dr. Abu Saleh Mohammad Rafi, your convener of the International Conference on the Trans Phenomenon in Language, Literature, and Culture. I'm joined by Dr. Jongfong Tian from Rutgers University, who will be moderating this session today. Jongfong, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rafi. So before we begin, we would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to the Department of English and Humanities at the University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh for organizing and hosting this special event. Your unwavering commitment to advancing critical conversations in education, language, and culture has made this gathering possible, and it is such an honor to co-host alongside such a visionary department. So this colloquium explores the transformative role of translanguaging as both a practice and a pedagogy within bi- and multilingual education. Taking a critical approach, we will examine the opportunities and challenges of integrating translanguaging into instruction and assessment across different educational contexts. So throughout our discussions today, we will advocate for centering decolonial and global South perspectives in translanguaging research, aligning with a broader agenda to achieve linguistic, epistemic, and social justice. Over to you, Rafi.
So I'll now briefly introduce our panelists. So Dr. Anna Mendoza is assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and does research in adult community education for refugee students and in French dual language immersion program. Dr. Prem Fayak is an associate professor of language, society, and education at Teachers College, Columbia University, New York, and with research interests in translanguaging, indigenous languages, decoloniality, and social justice. Dr. Angeline was Canada Research Chair in Plurilingual and Intercultural Education at Simon Fraser University, Canada, and currently she is Chair Professor at the Education University of Hong Kong, and her current research interests include trauma-informed care in TESOL and theorizing plurilingual assessment. Dr. Jamie Schissel is an Associate Professor at the University of North Carolina, whose research focuses on assessment, language education policy, and language education with culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Dr. Laura Hammond-Ortiz is an assistant professor of TESOL and bilingual education at the University of Rhode Island, whose research explores how to cultivate equity-oriented and linguistically expansive learning spaces for multilingual learners, particularly through translanguaging pedagogy. And we have Shakina Rajendram, who is an assistant professor in language and literacies education at the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education, University of Toronto. And her research focuses on supporting multilingual learners through critical translanguaging and multiliteracies pedagogies informed by decolonial perspectives from the global South. Yes, Jongfong.
So now let me walk you through today's agenda. We will begin with a 40-minute discussion with our 6 panelists. So this will be guided by a set of questions designed to spark meaningful dialogue. Following the discussion, we will have a 10-minute audience Q&A session, giving the audience an opportunity to engage directly with our speakers. And finally, we will conclude with closing remarks to wrap up this colloquium. So we are excited, very excited to have all of you here with us today, and I look forward to rich insights and discussions ahead. Okay, so let's begin with the first question. How do each of you see translanguaging transforming educational practices for bi- and multilingual students, particularly in terms of justice and equity? So I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see each other's face.
Who would you like to start with? Professor Angeline. Yes,
Yes,
please go ahead.
yeah, thank you, Chair. I think this is a really good movement. I would call it movement. However, I would see that I have been in this area for 30, 40 years. From my early classroom, at that time I still work in co-switching, co-mixing. I feel that we are making baby steps, but still very important baby steps. The reason why I want to say is lots of research are sociolinguists, applied sociolinguists, critical sociolinguists, and we tend to work in our micro classroom. I think we need to join hands with researchers and educators in working in the meso level and macro level. That is at the policy level. In terms of institutional policy, in terms of assessment, institutional policy, and also macro level, in terms of political economy, the linguistic market, because as long as the linguistic market, in Pierre Bourdieu's terms and Monica Haller's terms, as long as the macro linguistic market still privileges those hierarchies of languages, then at the micro classroom level, teachers, no matter how we try to transform our practices, parents, students themselves, the whole society, they want to access the linguistic capital because the macro level. But that doesn't mean that what we do is not important. It's just that no matter what we do, it's still at the micro level, which of course can impact people's attitudes. That's why I say sociolinguists, micro level classroom researchers, pedagogy researchers, we must join hands with researchers, not from our discipline, researchers working at meso institutional policy level, policy advocacy, and researchers at the macro political economy level. Otherwise, we will find that we are struggling and struggling all the time. I think I finished my 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you.
I
Anna.
think
Okay.
sorry.
That's okay, Prem. You can go ahead.
Yeah, I think just to be very brief, I begin with how we reimagine or imagine praxis or transformative praxis in translanguaging studies or translanguaging work. So I see as a praxis, it is not simply a random action, but rather a political struggle to challenge the status quo and inequalities that are built around, as Professor Angeline said, the broader political hegemony of linguistic capitalism and racism and Western modernity. So basically, when we see language practices, policies, or pedagogies in education, we see the dominant ontologies and epistemologies of languages are shaped dominantly by the linguistic capitalism that essentially objectifies and standardizes the languages to serve the free market, right? So that creates a lot of boundaries of languages, not only languages, but also spatial boundaries like home and school, cultural boundaries, dominant and minoritized, indigenous and non-indigenous, and also the boundaries around subjects, for example, math, science, social studies, and all these boundaries that are built around this dominant ideology of linguistic capitalism creates a lot of problems in terms of learning, assessment, curriculum, and pedagogies. So for me, translanguaging actually problematizes those boundaries created by linguistic capitalism in practice. And also, I see translanguaging as a way to reclaim right to speak. Working with indigenous and ethnic minorities students, I feel that as the boundaries are solidified through assessment, pedagogies, curriculum, the students don't see that they are really speaking in the classroom spaces, for example, or school spaces in general. So through translanguaging practices, they find there is spaces to reclaim this right to speak, not really being silent or very passive in the classroom, but they find some spaces to speak, right? So I think from that perspective, so we can see translanguaging as a kind of transformative practice.
I'm happy to go next. When we talk about translanguaging and equity and justice, I think a large focus of that is talking about social justice. And so many of our scholars in the field of translanguaging have spoken about this really powerful social justice implications. Two other areas of justice that I would like to emphasize in my response. One is something that Professors Garcia and Li Wei have been speaking more about recently, which is cognitive justice. And to that, I want to add emotional justice as well. And so in keeping with the spirit of your conference with the trans phenomena, we know that translanguaging is more than just affirming diverse language practices. It's also affirming different ways of knowing, different thought processes, different cultural understandings of knowledge. So for example, a student who is explaining scientific concepts using their own dialects or their own local named languages is not just demonstrating this amazing linguistic ability, but it's also showcasing a different framework of knowledge and understanding from where in the world they're situated. I have a 2-year-old daughter who loves the story The Hungry Caterpillar, which in summary is about a caterpillar who eats a lot, goes into a cocoon, and becomes a butterfly. And I know you have the moth or butterfly as your logo for this conference as well. But instead of calling the butterfly a butterfly and a caterpillar, she calls it a butterpillar. A butterpillar. And I think that's just a beautiful representation of translanguaging, where she's made up her own word to capture that beautiful metamorphosis of the butterfly, but when caterpillar into a butterfly. But the sad thing is when she goes to school, her teachers are going to say, no, it's not a butterpillar, it's a caterpillar. No, it's a butterfly. So translanguaging, when affirmed and celebrated, it actually challenges what we believe is academic knowledge, what is correct scientific knowledge, what's a correct scientific term, and what is an incorrect scientific term, by valuing different representations of knowledge alongside those that are typically expressed in English or a dominant language. And then very quickly, just the emotional justice element that I would like to emphasize as well. Language, social justice, cognitive justice, and emotional justice are all deeply interconnected. And so when students' whole selves are reflected and respected in the classroom, they experience that emotional safety, which is transformative for them, especially when other aspects of their identities are marginalized. So to sum up, I believe that translanguaging promotes different aspects of justice by honoring the full humanity of individual students in our classroom.
Quite multifaceted, isn't it? Yeah. Anna?
Yes, I'm happy to go next. Thank you very much for this invitation, Rafi and Zhongfeng. I think the people before have raised excellent points, especially Dr. Lin saying we need to work at a greater, bigger, broader level. But working at the micro level, I also believe that there are things that we important to hold people accountable to at the micro level of classrooms. I'll briefly mention 3 of them. First, you need to go beyond translanguaging only between English and the dominant societal language. For example, English and Nepali, English and Bangla, English and Cantonese in Hong Kong SAR, right? As our colleague Pramod Shah shows, to include all the immigrant and indigenous and tribal languages, including in literacy practices and specialized domains of knowledge, as we see in some of Prem's work, right? Second, Shakina has mentioned like the need to legitimize different ways of thought, and go beyond just legitimizing the codes. But something that's yet under-researched in the codes is how to legitimize translanguaging between prestige and non-prestige dialects of the same language, like English or Arabic or Swahili. Now, there's a lot of research of that in the humanities, but not in our field, right? So exploring that more in translanguaging research. And also, because translanguaging is so concerned with native speakerism, I think we also need to legitimize shifting between L1, L2, and HL features of the languages we use when translanguaging, right? Not just using them in native-like ways, but incorporating and legitimizing second language user features or heritage user features, right? So all these things we can hold people accountable to in the classrooms to at least in that context, ratify all classroom participants' ways of using language for justice and equity. Thank you.
I'm happy to.
Laura?
And next, yeah. Well, thank you. I want to echo Anna and say thank you for bringing this panel together and already getting some great conversations started with these different insights. When I think about the question around translanguaging as transforming educational practices for bilingual and multilingual students, I think, like Angel mentioned, it's important to situate the translanguaging work in the broader work that's been done for many, many decades now to transform educational experiences for language minoritized students. I think about work around funds of knowledge, work around culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy or sustaining pedagogy. And so I really see translanguaging kind of building upon these broader movements that have been working to center minoritized students' ways of knowing and ways of communicating. But I do think translanguaging work extends this work in an important way because of how it not only validates what and incorporates what bilingual and multilingual children know and bring, but also is really pushing us to rethink monolingual assumptions about bilingualism and multilingualism and to reframe the way that we think about language itself. To see dynamic languaging not as a problem or an aberration from some imagined norm, but as a resource for learning and as an authentic way of being bilingual and multilingual in the world. I think, unfortunately, the reality is that most students continue to be educated in one dominant language in the US, that's English. And so I think translanguaging pedagogy has begun to push, but I think certainly there's much more work that needs to be done. And I think your point, Angel, about kind of how do we think about expanding beyond the micro is really important there. I also think it's important to recognize that the micro matters. And some of the work that I've done with Zhongfang and some others as we've been engaging with the translanguaging research that exists is we've been trying to think about transformation a bit more expansively as a spectrum. So thinking about it not just as dismantling societal structures, but even recognizing the ways that teachers shifting their perspectives can have dramatic implications for students in the classroom. So a teacher seeing a student differently because she takes up a translanguaging stance means that student might have access to opportunities that they would not have otherwise had, which could change their entire educational trajectory. So I think it's important for us to continue to focus on, these small shifts that matter, while also working to continue to push the field to not stay there with the recognition work, but really to continue to move that work forward.
Okay, I'll wrap up our question number one kind of briefly. And again, just so much gratitude for bringing us all together. It's not often very common for us to be able to come in these shared spaces where we can not only get our ideas out, but kind of play around with what we're thinking. So not just always be like, this is exactly what it is, right? But we're allowed to really think through things here. And I really like having that type of space available. In terms of translanguaging as a transformative educational practice, right? A lot of my work focuses on assessment. So like I'm bringing that predominant lens when I'm talking about this and connecting with what everyone's saying here. I think what I'm always kind of questioning in this area is whose expertise is valued, and the expertise in like air quotes, right? Like how do we even define what expertise is? And translanguaging really, with all of the rethinking and creative reimaginings that come with it, really help us in assessment in particular, grapple with really long established protocols, standards, procedures that have not served racialized and minoritized language speakers for decades, centuries, right? And so that's one of the areas that I think translanguaging can become transformative. I think echoing what Laura was saying, transformative on a spectrum as well.
Thank you all. So the second question, I'm going to put it in the chat. So what are some unique opportunities and challenges of integrating translanguaging in instructional and assessment practices across diverse educational contexts? Yeah, I know some of you already sort of touch upon some points of that. So maybe you can further elaborate based on the empirical research that you conducted in your local context. Yeah. Angel?
Yes, I've come back to Hong Kong last year. The reason I come back is I want to, in Canada, I really couldn't change any of the assessment policies. Well, K to 12, but anyway, to put a long story short, right now I'm trying to leverage I have a project on the translanguaging assessment, theorizing plurilingual assessment, and I like to link up colleagues to leverage the disruptive technology of AI to see if we could leverage that to translanguage assessment in terms of the theoretical basis, because that's a very conservative, the theoretical basis of assessment, the standardized assessment. So here I would really like to connect with colleagues here. I do need your help, so I'll stop here. But this is something very important to have a position paper out that is high time. We really need to talk back to these traditional standardized assessment people, because there's a lot of washback effect, and teachers are made to feel guilty when parents, students, they say, oh, you do translanguaging pedagogy, but at the end of the day, we need to do all those monolingual assessments. So many teachers told me that. So I'll stop here.
If I may, I'll just add on to what you're saying, Angel. Is that Primer? Did you want to?
Yeah, Jamie, go ahead. Yeah, it's your area, so that's
okay.
Interesting.
So just to kind of zoom back a little bit about the situation of the history of how we got to where we are. One way of understanding how we got to where we are with assessments, right? Is just kind of knowing that linguistic diversity has traditionally been treated as a potential threat to measurement or a potential measurement error, or a variable that needs to be controlled for. And so when writing up test specifications, for example, you'll say, the target audience is this idealized monolingual speaker, right? Maybe in different terms, but like that's written up very formally, so that the test it's within every area of the design. That's part of it. That's called the theory of language that informs the test design, the test construct. That is not to say that there haven't been decades of critical researchers or critical scholars or critical educators that have found issue with this, right? There's long documentation also of this kind of parallel track of people engaging with assessment with a critical mind for minoritized populations. And that has remained very peripheral within assessment development. One additional problem within assessment design and development that is often not talked about is this idea that assessments are also designed now, in more recent times, this idea of test accommodations, right? So actually making adaptations to the test based on linguistic diversity. It started for students with disabilities in the United States and then it expanded for linguistic diversity. But one of the main areas within what you're supposed to do with test accommodations is not provide any type of unintentional advantage for bilingual and multilingual students. So you can't let their bilingualism enhance what they're able to do on the assessment. So this is all from the test construction perspective, right? And so taking all of that into consideration, I think these are good ways to argue that that world is not equipped to make equitable, justice-oriented approaches and assessment to meet the needs of these students. So starting from that knowledge base and starting from that way of understanding how assessment functions, it's very ill-equipped. And so looking to the world of assessment, although there are a lot of strides being made, looking for them in terms of them being leaders, needs to be done with a lot of caution. I would say instead what I've worked with Zhang Feng on this and with Kate Seltzer on this and reviewing all of the literature that's been currently documented with translanguaging and assessment, and we've included plurilingualism and assessment too, Nigel, is that there is kind of this like growing wave of evidence of promising directions in assessment with linguistic diversity in mind, which is completely absent, based on what I had just told you from these other perspectives in the field. And knowing that is really helpful for those of us who are very critically minded, right? Like we're our own toughest critics. And so to find something that can begin to dismantle what's been going on for decades, centuries around assessment is really quite powerful.
I can also, since Jamie brought up Kate Seltzer, right? I also agree with Kate Seltzer that, sometimes the final product should be translingual. It might not be the standardized assessment, but it could be a published class anthology like the one that I observed students make in Hawaii that sold like 1,000 copies on Amazon, right? That's a high stakes final product of translingual creative writing. And something I think that teachers need to become aware of is that just because it's translingual doesn't mean it's sloppier than a monolingual product, right? I agree with people like Suresh Kanagaraja and Kate Seltzer who say, students should be exposed to translingual literary works in class and, be able to experiment with creating that themselves, right? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just to add on that, I think from more instructional perspective, I haven't done work on assessment, but one of the opportunities that we have is teachers are actually doing it. It's not something new that we are inventing. Like, in multilingual, bilingual context, working with ethnic minoritized students or indigenous students, teachers are doing it. So what we need to do is just work with teachers and acknowledge their work and see how their work is transformative. For example, and also what is really interesting to see is how we are creating this boundary between oracy and literacy. So we don't really acknowledge the rich oral tradition that students or teachers bring in the classroom. There are a lot of mostly the modern education is kind of governed by this notion of testing or assessment or teaching as something which is very standardized, that actually erases the oral traditions that students bring into the classroom and also teachers bring in the classroom. So I think the one opportunity that we have is we have really kind of rich oral traditions that students and teachers bring in the classroom. We just need to recognize that, right? And that also leads to recognizing kind of the boundary between what is the process and what is the product, right? So we often, like as Jamie and Anna said, like we aim for producing something which is so monolingual and so standardized that basically erases the oral practices and other diverse ways of meaning making that that students actually do in the classroom in the process of producing that final product, right? So I think one opportunity that we have is actually we have very diverse oral traditions that students and teachers bring in the classroom, and we just need to work with the teachers. And also, I think what I see like working with indigenous ethnic minority students and teachers is they bring in not only the language resources, different dialects or different ways of speaking, but also they bring a lot of epistemologies into classroom, right, through their languages. Particularly the students who have almost lost their languages, for example, indigenous languages, because of oppressive language policy and practices. They still bring in this knowledge that they have actually learned from their parents, their community members, for example, but they just have some very key concepts to talk about those knowledge, but not necessarily full repertoire in that particular named language, right? So I think we can use, as Simpri Makoni talks about, we can use a lot of like key conceptual ideas that represent the broader epistemologies and that create more epistemic diversities in the classroom. And I can see that like students and teachers actually understand what makes sense by bringing those oral traditions and different varieties of knowledge and epistemologies, for example, in the classroom. So I think we really have those resources already there. We just need to understand how those resources can be used in the classroom. So that's what I think. But the broader challenge, as Angeline mentioned, is we have very big structural and ideological challenges that actually shapes the whole discourse of teacher education, and that situates the teacher's language practices in very deficit and including the product, right? So I see teachers struggling to make sense of their teaching, and students are also struggling to make sense of their learning, for example, particularly in dominant English medium or national language classes. But we really need to acknowledge that struggle as a political action, right? It's not something that happens overnight. It's something that is happening as a response to historical operations that teachers have been in through this very hegemonic modern educational mechanisms. So I think we have a lot to do to respond to that structural and ideological challenge. Thanks. Yeah, I think I took over.
Thanks, Prem. I'm happy to jump in next. In the same line of thinking around instruction, most of my work has also looked at instruction over assessment, although I think assessment is very important for us to think about with translanguaging. Much of the work I've done in translanguaging has focused specifically on bilingual learning contexts. And so I think in those contexts, there are a lot of unique opportunities and challenges that we still are, as a field, trying to unpack. I have thought a lot about some of the pushback to translanguaging in those types of spaces. Michael Guerrero has an article where he talks about the appropriateness of translanguaging for bilingual contexts. Jasona Sinosa and Dirk Gorder talk about the sustainability of translanguaging in immersion contexts, especially where language revitalization is concerned. And so something that I think a lot about in my own work is how can translanguaging be a part of spaces where there are very clear power dynamics that translanguaging can sometimes shift in ways that do not empower students. And Prem, I was glad when you brought up kind of the right to speak, because I've thought about the right to speak in spaces where translanguaging in a minoritized language learning space actually means English, and English speakers are gaining the right to speak. So I think that's a tension that exists in the translanguaging scholarship when it's applied to practice. And I don't think that means that translanguaging doesn't belong in those spaces, but I do think it raises new questions about how do we think about equity and equitable access to learning when we have speakers of the societal dominant language in that space, and when we have we're trying to privilege spaces for learning in a minoritized language. There's an article in TESOL Quarterly that Anna took the lead on with, that some of us have contributed to, really pushing for a contextual-based understanding of how translanguaging can be taken up, both in research and in practice. And so I do think, continuing to think about the unique and situated context in which translanguaging pedagogies are being enacted is so important. And also, to your point, Prem, I mean, I think we need to center who students are and who teachers are in that work too. I've started to think about translanguaging as something that is mediated by the context within which teachers are working and by the teachers themselves as they take up these different more dynamic ways of embracing students' linguistic repertoires. And so that for me is, I don't think we have a solution. I think it's a tension that we're still kind of thinking through. Certainly, we still need to bring translanguaging into those types of spaces, but I think and kind of thinking carefully about language and power dynamics is something that's important to keep considering.
Okay, thank you all. I'm getting a lot of ideas. So I'm very enjoying this conversation. Okay, so the next question I want to discuss the role of Global South perspectives. So how can translanguaging research from the Global South shape or redefine translanguaging's role in promoting linguistic, epistemic, and social justice? How can translanguaging practices challenge colonial legacies in education and contribute to broader social justice goals?
I would love to speak to this if I may, and I'm going to build a little bit on what Anna Mendoza said in her opening remarks. I think many mainstream studies on translanguaging that come from global North contexts still use a binary or a bilingual orientation whereby English is studied or analyzed in relation to a local language. So it's, the role of English as a dominant language in relation to a local language or a national dominant language. But when we talk about multilingual communities in the global South, and when we look at their language practices, they're seldom binary. Instead, they often operate within these really rich linguistic ecologies where there are multiple languages and dialects, hundreds, thousands sometimes, both colonial as well as vernacular, a part of everyday life. And so in regions or countries with colonial histories, and I'll talk a little bit about Malaysia, where a lot of my work is situated, even post-independence from our colonial powers, colonialism still continues linguistically because a dominant local language starts imitating colonial powers by then acting as a gatekeeper and continuing to marginalize other local and indigenous languages that are seen as inferior in this new power hierarchy. And back when I did my PhD dissertation many years ago now, just one quote from a 9-year-old student that still shakes me to the core today when I think about it is when I asked her about how she felt when her local languages were marginalized by the other dominant local languages. She said, our country has gained independence, but we haven't. And this is in the context of, Malaysia having gained independence from the British for, almost 70 years now, but she felt like she was continuing to be colonized because her local language was now much lower down in the power hierarchy, even though the position of English had been shaken post-independence. So I think translanguaging research from the global South is really crucial for challenging these new or neo-colonial legacies by disrupting not just the dominance of English or French or those high status colonial languages, but also those dominant languages that start acting as gatekeepers for other languages. And we cannot have this conversation without talking about race. Like Marconi and Pennycook have talked about how languages are colonial inventions, but in the process of naming languages, often the construct of race itself was created. In Malaysia, till today, we have to identify our race in every form that we fill out. We have to identify our race, and our race is not Malaysian. We have to identify ourselves as an Indian or a Chinese or a Malay, even though all of us were born in Malaysia. And so race and language, they're both constructions of colonialism, and we cannot advocate for more linguistically just policies without also looking at local racial conflict and ethnic tensions and so on. So this work is really political in the global South. I continue to get lots of pushback from colleagues and policymakers and people in power in Malaysia when I present this work, but it's important to be doing things like this conference today where we talk about translanguaging and its challenges in the global South so that we're addressing localized linguistic inequities and we're giving visibility to those minoritized languages that have less political, racial, and social power.
Yes, and kind of going off with what Shakina said, I have heard that, you know, in some countries, for example, India, where people because they feel oppressed due to their linguistically or by gender, that actually drives them to cleave back to standard English again in order to gain the upper hand. So for example, girls from lower socioeconomic backgrounds pursue English because their languages are not valued, right, over the dominant language, Hindi, and just to gain the upper hand, right? I've seen this in the micro level classroom too. If the classroom majority, which is Filipino and boys, are very, very loud, actually classroom language minorities and students from other countries and Filipino girls will cleave to English to try to like take away some of their power because they're being oppressed, right? So we see these kind of going in circular ways. It's important that it's not just a chain going top to bottom. These things go in circular and elliptical ways. I also feel personally right now, I've adopted a translingual literacies approach that's pioneered in the global south in Senegal by Friederike Lupke and colleagues, where you teach adults who are beginning their literacy skills, their textual literacy skills, to use the Latin alphabet to write across all their languages without regard to the boundaries between the languages and disregarding spelling as well, right? So they're using literacy as a practical tool and not just a code. And that's been really important for some adult students we're working with who are resettled people from Afghanistan after the US pulled out of Afghanistan. And, you know, it's important, I think, that to take great ideas and apply them in practice here in the United States. So yeah, and also to remember that translanguaging research in the Global South has existed since the 60s, maybe even under a different name, like World Englishes, right? That was actually translanguaging research. There was more content on translanguaging in World Englishes research than content trying to codify global varieties of English, which actually Shakina and I have mentioned in a paper that's going to come out soon, or a chapter. So yeah, those things. Thank you.
I think I will add something on that. Thank you. I think we also need to really problematize this whole notion of global South. I think for me, I would see it as a space where the struggle, mostly political struggle and conflicts between colonial, imperial, global domination, and more transformative or critical work that do not really fit with this really homogeneous or universal discourse of what really counts as learning, education, assessment, and teaching, right? So as I said before, I think we really need to shift from kind of seeing global South as a deficit and recognizing their alternative ways of knowing, doing, and most importantly, also being. So how do you be as a learner, for example, in the classroom? How do you be as a teacher, you know, a teacher like in language classroom, for example, in the global South? There are different ways of being in the classroom, for example. And also, you know, that being does not really fit in this dominant discourse of, you know, what it means to be a teacher, what are your accountabilities and what are your expected performances, for example. You know, these are something, these issues, broader issues, are something that actually shape how teachers understand, right, their own roles in the classroom. For example, most often teachers, even if like they understand that what kind of like monolingual language policies and pedagogies do not work, even if they understand, they had to, like, you know, follow more standardized or standard ways of doing things, just because their ways of thinking, their ways of knowing is historically not really been part of, teacher education and even teacher training and also the assessment, for example. So what I would say basically is, from the Global South perspective, we really need to see recognize our own struggles, right? And how we are actually engaging in this conflict with this so-called universal notion of education, for example. There is no one way of doing things, right? It has never happened like that. But when we started having policies, language policies, for example, we started seeing not only like the world, but also nation states. The whole project of the nation state itself is very colonial, right? And for example, having one language, one nation, one language, one education, one language, one culture, and one nation, that created a lot of problem. So for me, from Global South perspective, it is really important to see how, this Western European modern ways of knowing, doing, and being education travel, right? To, how we import it, for example, how people import it in the Global South, and what does it mean, right? For example, and how does it shape, for example, the mentality and ideologies and pedagogies in the context. So it's more like understanding tensions, right? And translanguaging gives some space to understand that tensions in different spaces, for example, in classroom, even in our everyday life, for example, how we are being judged upon, how we are evaluated, how we are, how our identities are kind of seen, for example. So for me, like, it's not something like either or thing. It's like, as Nelson Maldonado Torres talks really nicely about, we breathe, we live, the coloniality every day. So we just need to find the spaces with our teachers and the students to understand that conflicts, right? I think that is more liberatory, and that is more transformative in terms of more ideological and epistemological stances.
Thank you all for your insightful answers. Okay, so one last question. As scholars advocating for translanguaging, what future directions or pressing questions should the field prioritize, especially in bi- and multilingual educational contexts?
Can I go first? I think I would just like, sorry guys. So the one thing that I see is we really need to focus on our linguistic lifeways. I feel like sometimes just telling my story coming from very oppressive language policy where schools and nation state ban the language. For example, I was not allowed to speak my mother tongue. It's very complicated, right? So, for example, but my linguistic lifeways were different from what I was actually taught in school, for example. So just telling our own story would be really wonderful, like just doing oral histories and how people have gone through the different language policy context, for example, just tell our story. So that would be wonderful. And one critical issue that I see in translanguaging field is we are more kind of course, we are really obsessed with data, linguistic data, right? And I think in the age of AI, there are so many things that that we can talk about, but when we just talk about data, like we just see what is happening at present with the participants, but we really erase the loss of languages, particularly in the context of indigenous communities and of course language minoritized communities. So we don't really see, we start from what is happening here if we really obsess with language practices, but we don't really see what has been lost, right? So from indigenous perspective, we also need to really focus on how translanguaging can or cannot really contribute to the reclamation of languages. So that really leads us to doing very purposeful translanguaging, creating the not really just random, as I said in the beginning. So we don't really just focus on how students and teachers make sense of their learning or teaching by using their existing linguistic repertoire, but also going back and see what they have actually lost, right? Because of this, the oppressive historical policies, colonial, nation state, whatever we call it, or in general, Western modern education. So that really challenges us. Like, let's go back and see how, languages can be reclaimed, not only what to promote what we have now, right? So that's something that I see that we all have challenges to understand translanguaging as an approach to help indigenous communities reclaim their languages, and particularly those who are already dispossessed with because of all these oppressive language policy practices. I think that's what I say, right? Thank you.
And to go off of what Prem said about reclaiming, I think translanguaging scholarship needs to make stronger connections between translanguaging and SLA. And, we often think about making connections to SLA. Oh, that's standardized tests, but SLA is not standardized tests. SLA is reclaiming minority languages. SLA is learning to acquire English according to, more fluid world Englishes norms or lingua franca norms. Translanguaging teachers want to see translanguaging, leading to expansion of the student repertoire and not just acquisition of the native speaker standard norms, but also expansion. So we need to hold ourselves accountable to see how translanguaging can help SLA, especially when it comes to things more like indigenous and heritage languages, world Englishes, and English as a lingua franca.
If I may, I think we also need to translanguage our knowledge production space, our journal publications, because we are constantly not preaching. We are preaching. No, we are not. What do you say? Walk the walk. That's us. So if we can really translanguage our research space, production space, like in this forum, if we can translanguage, like in our journal publications. I know Suresh Kanagaraja tried, but we really need to, I know Zhongfeng is trying. I think we really need to, people accuse us of being Hippocratic. I think Realcock, my dear friend, accused us of being Hippocratic, saying that we advocate for translanguaging, but then we public the very fact that the discourse, the research article in which we discuss translanguaging is written in one language. So there are many reasons why we do that, English as a lingua franca, but I think we really need to answer to those queries. We might not like to listen to those queries. We might find them annoying, but we really need to search our soul. And why are we doing this in English only? I'll stop here. 可以講廣東話嘛？
Yeah, I was gonna say too, as much as I love talking to all of you, we need to sometimes do less of talking to each other and more of talking to teachers and students out there in more accessible ways, beyond just the traditional journal article that reaches, people in the ivory towers who have access to these journals. But also just to conclude by talking a little bit about what Angel said at the beginning about how transformation needs to happen at the macro level. And then Laura talked about how the micro level matters as well. Students, they're an amazing, perfect bridge between the macro and micro. People, policymakers may not listen to teachers much, school leaders, but they do listen to students in many contexts. And so it's crucial moving forward in translanguaging research that we prioritize meaningful collaboration with students, not just as recipients of our translanguaging strategies, but as actually active participants and co-creators in the entire research process in designing translanguaging strategies, implementing them, and even evaluating their own translanguaging and languaging practices. And then, having students present these findings to school leaders or to advocate for translanguaging in school policies, I think can really send a more powerful message to decision makers than just hearing from people in the ivory tower or just from teachers. And in this way, we're also empowering students as agents of change in their own education.
Yeah, I want to build upon that because I totally agree that that is an important direction for translanguaging research. I mentioned before kind of this notion of a spectrum of, like recognition work all the way to deconstructing systems. And I think a lot of the important translanguaging work that is happening with research and with practice needs to continue to push towards more critical applications. It's great to think about bringing languages in and having spaces where students are, able to use their diverse linguistic repertoires that they bring into the classroom spaces. But I think the criticality is still something that we need to work towards, both in research and in practice. Some of the things that I think work really well, in addition to what you just mentioned, Shakina, are, engaging students and teachers in just analyzing language spaces around them. I work with a lot of pre-service and practicing teachers, and I have them do linguistic landscapes of their own schools. We call them schoolscapes, where they walk around the building and just think about the languages that are represented on the walls in the school space and how that reflects or doesn't reflect the students in their classrooms. And it's amazing that something so simple can spark such deep awareness or critical language awareness of the way that language and power operates. And students can do that too, right? In their own schools, in their communities, think about language and the way that they use language and others are using language in different spaces. So I think that's an area to keep pushing, both in work with teachers and in classrooms. And I also, and maybe this will be a toss next to Jamie, I think translanguaging in assessment is so important. I do a lot of work with teachers around translanguaging, and we often run into barriers around standardized assessments and teachers feeling the pressure of having students needing to produce in monoglossic or monolingual ways. And so I think that's an area that we really need to keep working as a field to open up more spaces for students to be able to show what they know and have that be validated and legitimized in more than just one language or in a societal dominant language.
Thanks, Laura. I don't have too much to add. I think I do like the call for more people in assessment just because I think it's desperately needed work because of how gatekeeping it can be. But in general, I sat in on the previous session, and so I think just talking about being what Ophelia and Li Wei said was to be courageous in the work, right? So these ideas that we're saying right now, really, when you're starting to put them into practice, right? Like they might feel risky, right? Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it doesn't feel risky at all, and that feels weird too. And so just really like being creative, being courageous, being out there with your work in ways that don't always fit an expected mold or norm.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I was just gonna thank you to all of you and for offering these insights to help us continue to push the boundaries, right? And I'm seeing the time, we are around the end, so I'm gonna hand it to my colleague Rafi to close the session.
Yes, I would also like to thank everybody, especially to our panelists for their thought-provoking contributions. So as we conclude, we hope that this colloquium has inspired new perspective and sparked further conversation on how translanguaging can be a powerful tool for transformative change in education, also in broader society in terms of acknowledging these practices and building prestige on them. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to continuing this important dialogue in the future. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. That was such an illuminating session. I certainly enjoyed myself. I'm Jahanara, and I'll be your MC for the closing ceremony. And I'm a lecturer at the University of Liberal Arts, the Department of English and Humanities. As we conclude this enriching conference, the trans phenomena in language, literature, and culture, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to all the esteemed speakers, panelists, and participants for their insightful contributions and active engagement. I would now like to ask the Pro-Vice Chancellor of ULAB, Professor Jude William Hanilo, to share his remarks with us. Thank you, sir.
Okay, good evening, distinguished guests, esteemed speakers, and valued participants. As we come to the close of this remarkable international conference on the trans phenomenon in language, literature, and culture, it is with immense gratitude and reflection that I deliver these concluding remarks. Over the past 2 days, we have delved into the transformative forces shaping our understanding of language, literature, and culture in a world marked by rapid change and intersectionality. This conference has been a testament to the power of collaboration and dialogue. Representatives from 10 countries, including the Philippines and Bangladesh, have shared their insights, fostering a vibrant exchange of ideas. With more than 100 presentations, 2 keynote addresses, 4 plenary sessions, and 4 panel discussions, we have explored diverse perspectives on transnationalism, transculturalism, and transdisciplinarity, concepts that challenge us to think beyond conventional boundaries. It is especially enlightening to listen to the keynote speech of ULAB Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities, Professor Kaiser Hag. I've learned a lot about the theories surrounding the trans and meta phenomenon, tracing its origins and development. I particularly like his warning not to be beholden to theories and to use theories as guides and tools. He likened a theory to a dinghy, which is used as a water transport. Having served its purpose, you should not be beholden to it and carry it with you as you travel on land, as it would no longer be helpful on your onward journey. The hybrid format of this event, day 1 on-site at the ULAB campus and day 2 online, reminds us of the dynamic possibilities of technology in bridging distances and amplifying voices. It has allowed us to connect regardless of geography and to engage with ideas that resonate across borders. I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to our keynote speakers, panelists, presenters, and participants who have made this conference a rich intellectual experience. Your contributions have not only illuminated the complexities of the trans phenomenon, but have also provided pathways for future research and collaborations. To the organizers, volunteers, and the Department of English and Humanities at ULAB, thank you for your tireless dedication in bringing this vision to life. The seamless execution of an event of this scale, blending in-person and virtual components, is no small feat, and your efforts have ensured its resounding success. What transpired in the past 2 days reflects the ULABian spirit, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary in nature, exploring new ideas and angles, debate, dialogue, and reflection in the true liberal arts tradition. As we conclude, let us carry forward the insights gained here, not only as scholars and educators, but as global citizens committed to fostering inclusive and transformative dialogue. Let this conference be a starting point for deeper engagement, where the boundaries of language, literature, and culture continue to be interrogated and expanded. Thank you for all your participation, energy, and enthusiasm. We look forward to welcoming you again to future events and continuing this enriching journey together. Good night to all of you, and thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I would like to welcome Professor Kaiser Hock, Dean, School of Arts and Humanities, next to share his remarks. Thank you, sir.
Oh dear. Am I visible and audible? Good.
Yes, sir.
Distinguished guests, colleagues from home and abroad, and all participants attending this session, good evening. It's been an exciting 2 days for all of us, and it gives me great pleasure to thank the ULAB administration, the Vice Chancellor and the Pro Vice Chancellor, who and also the Treasurer and Registrar, who not only helped us organize it, but even parties took part in it, because Jude, the Pro Vice Chancellor, was very much present at the first session, and his response is a testament to the value of this conference. You see, the trans phenomenon encapsulates language, literature, culture, and the faculty that I head as dean includes specialists in applied linguistics, literature, and cultural studies. Now, looking back on the conference, I think I should point out one lack. We were talking about translanguaging and transnational and translinguistic phenomena. But we had no participation from the Department of Bengali, which is in my faculty. So in future, I think in any conference dealing with language and literature, we will make a special effort to draw the faculty members and students of the Department of Bengali to participate and interact with DEH and with the literature and applied linguistics people in DEH and CLS. And in fact, as I was listening to some of the panel discussions on translanguaging, the presence of Bangla specialists would have really made translanguaging come alive, because we were listening to abstract discussions on the value of translanguaging, but we would have seen something, seen translanguaging in practice in critical discourse if we had a Bengali specialist participation. So I hope well, in future, this is one area that I will keep in mind, and I would like to have the entire faculty take part enthusiastically and meaningfully in all our conferences. But it's been an engaging and inspiring experience. And I hope that our critical faculties are sharper today than they were a couple of days back, because that is the ultimate aim of all literary and cultural studies, to sharpen the critical faculty, without which we will not be properly human or liberal. So thank you all, and with that I'll hand over to Jahanara, who's done a marvelous job as one of the organizers.
Thank you so much, sir. Lovely insights. Next in line, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Abdullah Al-Mahmoud, an associate professor at the Department of English and Humanities and one of the co-conveners for this conference. Professor Mahmoud, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Ms. Jahanara. It's great to be here at this closing ceremony. We have had 2 wonderful days, and most of the things that I was actually carrying in mind to talk about have been said by Professor Jude and Professor Kaiser Hawk. And it's lovely to be here and listening to all the great speakers and scholars. And I would take this opportunity to thank the last panelists of today, which I have been here from the beginning till the end. And once again, I remember all the panelists, all the 2 keynote speakers, and the 4 panels that brought together many scholars and professors, academics from universities and universities home and abroad. We had we had a special event today, which was amazing, wonderful. I personally have been very benefited, and then I had some questions about translanguaging myself, and then that have been clarified by Professor Ophelia Garcia and Professor Lee Wei. So overall, I would say we have got a chance to work together. I mean, the team at our Department of English and Humanities. I'm personally grateful and thankful to our HOD, Ms. Arifa Ghani Rahman, and Ms. Nadia Rahman, and Dr. Abu Salim Muhammad Rafi, the one who has initiated the whole thing, and then we have continued. It has been a great thing, I believe, and we will continue this. And as Professor Kaiser Hawk, our teacher, professor of professors, and sometimes I really like to mention this at many places. I mean, these professors' insights actually go beyond, our publications or our structured ways of disseminating knowledge, which have benefits in terms of metrics and other indexes. So thank you, sir, once again. He has rightly mentioned that our critical faculties have been sharpened. So that's what is the main benefit of this conference is. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your lovely insights and your remarkable contribution. I would now like to call Ms. Arifa Ghani Rahman, the head and associate professor at the Department of English and Modern Languages. English and Humanities. My apologies. To deliver her vote of thanks.
Thank you, Jahana. Yes, good evening, everyone. I'm privileged. I know everyone has, prior to me, has given some thanks, but I really have the privilege at this point to express my heartfelt gratitude to the real doers, the cogs in the well-oiled machine that is the University of Liberal Arts Bangladesh, where I am honored to work with some of the most wonderful colleagues. Pardon me. I'm proud to head the Department of English and Humanities and carry on the legacy of those who have headed the department before me, particularly Professor Shamshad Murtaza, who has set very high standards for us to follow. The department is committed to knowledge sharing and to creating platforms of various kinds for researchers to do just that. 2 of the significant modes we provide are international conferences like this one for local and global researchers, and the department's signature event, the annual Inter-University Student Conference and Cultural Competition, which, by the way, is celebrating its 10th iteration this year for students to share their research and creative work in a friendly competition that also helps to build networks and prepare them for larger platforms. I'll begin by thanking our keynote speakers of the conference, Professor Kaiser Hawk and Professor Guofang Li, who have given of their wisdom transculturally, transnationally, and translinguistically. You both set the tone for the theme and provided us with much to think about. To the plenary speakers, Dr. Asfar Hussain, Dr. Mahmoud Hassan Khan, Dr. Sham Sharma, and Dr. Neera Rahman. To the panel discussants, the special event speakers, Dr. Lee Wei and Dr. Ophelia Garcia, the presenters and participants, we are indebted to you for your enthusiastic response and subsequent contributions. My gratitude to ULAB's Vice Chancellor, Professor Imran Rahman, who has always encouraged and supported the department and pushed us to excel. My profound thanks to Professor Jude William Henilo, Pro-Vice Chancellor of ULab, who is equally supportive of our efforts and who has given his time to ensure that we begin and end our conference with a flourish. Professor Milan Kumar Bhattacharjee, Treasurer ULab, who has always been reassuring whenever we have had doubts about our abilities financially and otherwise. Without the vote of confidence from these three people, we could not have made this happen. My thanks to our registrar, Colonel Faizul Islam, who has ensured that we do not have any administrative issues in organizing this event. Dr. Shamshad Murtaza, words are not enough to express our thanks to you for the advice and constant guidance despite your unbelievably busy schedule. I hope we did not disappoint you. Dr. Rafi Saleh, thank you for being the think tank behind the conference and for ensuring a rich, truly rich and diverse panel of speakers. It was not easy to pull everyone together, but you did it, and I truly appreciate your efforts. Dr. Abdullah Al Mahmoud, a quiet, humble force, thank you for taking care of everything behind the scenes and providing much needed confidence in our colleagues to forge ahead. Nadia Rahman, what do I say? You give not only of your time and energy, but I believe of your soul to ensure that each and every detail is accounted for. And the conference went without a hitch only because of your commitment. I cannot express how profoundly grateful I am to you for everything always. To my colleagues and central members of the conference committee, Madi, Rumman, Nusrat, Mehek, Oliur, Jahanara, and Anika, thank you so much for each fulfilling your responsibilities that ensured the grand success of this conference. To Muntasir, Tanzia, Zilani, Nahian, Itlifa, and Neha, our other colleagues who came in at different points of the organization and ensured that the execution was pitch perfect, my gratitude. My heartfelt thanks to our admin officers, Shunjib and Nuzhat, for working behind the scenes to bring this conference to a successful conclusion. From the administration, my thanks to Rokon Nazmul Aminul Fahim from the Communications Office, profound gratitude to Maqsud Bhai, Moon, and Asifur Rahman Khan. From the IT Office, heartfelt thanks to Arif Billah, Istiaq Ahmed, Yusuf, Noor Alam, Kaisar, Protip, Shamsher, and Amrin. And finally, to thank some of the most important people who support us with everything they have, the teaching assistants, Fatima, Nazia, and Nabila, and their fantastic team of volunteers, Abu Shahid, Afia Adiba, Afia Sultana, Ayman, Akbar, Al-Naqib, Othoy, Aisha, Bidhan, Husnul, Jannatul Fariha Mim, Kanis Fatima, Kifayat, Mahjabin, Mashiat, Marifa, Nafisa, Rabia, Raisanam, Raisa Zareen, Ridwan, Sadia Afrin, Salman, Sanjida, Shakiri, Sharif, Sharika, Sumaya, Sani, Tabassum, Talal, Tanzim, Tarannum, Yamuni, and Yusuf Abdullah Toki. I'm sorry, I have to mention every one of them by name. It's a long list and they have worked tirelessly. And I hope I haven't missed anyone. And if I have, I apologize, but know that you have my profound gratitude. Thank you everyone for patiently hearing me out. And thank you for being here with us at this conference. And as I bid good night, I invite you to join us on December 19th and 20th at the 10th Inter-University Student Conference and Cultural Competition, as well as at other events at the Department of English and Humanities, ULab. Take care. Good night.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And thank you all once again. And we'll all look forward to welcoming you in our upcoming academic endeavors. Thank you very much.